All right, students, we are going to wrap up chapter 14 today. We're going to end the Civil War finally here. We're going to, after that, tomorrow, we're going to set up and start our review for our test on Friday. So we are going to get in place and ready to go and be able to knock that last chapter test out, and then after that we are going to move into our semester final test. So this is the last teaching PowerPoint and video you're going to watch with me, but you'll get to be entertained by me just a little bit more with some other PowerPoints of review. No, I'm kidding. But anyways, let's just jump right into here, 14.4.1, the end of the war. Okay, so after Lee loses in Gettysburg, that next day, Grant takes Vicksburg, which effectively splits the South completely off from its Mississippi western holdings. So they lose access to their beef, a lot of their food, and to a large number of troops that could have helped supplement Lee's armies and also the other armies of Sherman that are going to come across and start to lay waste to the South. Now, one of the things is that we are going to talk about is Sherman's what we call his march to the sea. The very first part of it is the march to Atlanta, but one of the things that we really have to look at here is what is the impact of what Sherman does in the South, because it's critical. We talk about this because most people look at the southern portion of Sherman's campaign and are like, well, the war is still happening up north in Virginia between Lee and between Grant. What does Sherman have to do down here in the South? We don't talk about major epic battles and clashes, which there are some battles and there's some clashes. But what Sherman does is he moves into the idea of total warfare, where he's going to show no mercy to the South. That is the biggest part of this, is the lack of mercy that Sherman is going to show on the South. All right, so what he does is he takes, and the army size in the book is slightly probably off. It says it takes 60,000 men. Most people believe it's probably closer to 100 to 120,000 men. Why are war numbers so off all the time? It's because you have troops coming and going all the time. You have armies splitting off and then reforming again. You'd probably want to say that Sherman's actual force that he's commanding is about 60,000 men, and then he has another general with him who's commanding about 40,000 men alongside him. So that's why I look at more of the complete number of about 100,000 men up to 120,000, because Sherman is basically wreaking havoc throughout the South with very little opposition, because no Southern army this deep South has the numbers to be able to meet him effectively on the battlefield. Now, one of the things that he talks about, Sherman says, we are not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people. Therefore, we need to make old and young, rich and poor feel the hard hand of war. Sherman, his whole viewpoint is not, I'm going to destroy an army. I'm going to go destroy the people. He wants to demoralize them. He wants them to give in. He wants them to plead to their leaders to end this war because they are suffering. And he does bring suffering down upon those who oppose him. This is why he's one of the most hated men in the South, even today, is because the sheer amount of suffering that he brings upon the Southern people. And so when he's marching towards Atlanta, and then when he goes up and he's moving into South Carolina, he goes in there. He does have supply trains, but for the most part, he tells his men, we're going to eat whatever's in our way. So they go out, and when they hit a farm, they'll harvest whatever they can. They'll eat what they can, and then they'll burn the rest of the field. If they find cattle, pigs, anything that they could eat that's an animal, they would butcher what they needed, maybe for a few days extra, and then they would kill the rest of the animals and make sure the meat was unedible, either burning it or dumping manure or something else to befoul the meat to make it unusable for anybody else that would come. Sherman's whole view here is we're going to make sure that they have no longer the economic means or the willingness to wage war. By stripping them of farmland and stripping them of food, this creates not only starvation for the army, but starvation for the civilian population. Guess what happens when you have hungry civilians? They are not willing to send food up to the troops in the north. They would rather eat. So it is a dual starvation method where either side is going to end up starving, and what happens is both sides end up starving. Both the military and the civilians are sitting there unable to eat. And so, again, when we look at this, the Confederacy, he really sees this as the supporting of the civilian population is what allows the army to continue on. He wants to break their spirit. And so when you look at his reign, what they call like reign of terror through the South, he believes that it's over 300 miles long and usually up to 60 miles wide. He would destroy everything within that vicinity, 30 miles on either side. He would just lay waste. He'd burn farms, destroy homes, anything that really got in his way. More often than not, a town might be spared, but at the same time, the towns would quickly fall apart without needed supplies, food, material in order to make sure that their cities could be successful still. This idea that he brings up, though, is total warfare in the sense that you see it in future war. You don't just see this at the Civil War, you see it in future war. The whole idea of total war, of demoralizing an enemy civilian population, really comes out of the Civil War. Was there attacks in other wars where civilian population was attacked? Yes, but we're talking about modern military strategy. The idea of total war comes out of the South and really comes underneath Sherman's umbrella of how to effectively wage total warfare against a hostile population in order to break the will of those who want to fight you. One of the things that is talked about in modern warfare, why people say that there's a hard time winning, it's because the United States is taking up a more of a position of strategic airstrikes, strategic targeting of military assets. And this is not just complete and totally new to the United States. We tried to do it in World War II at first, and we also had to shift to a total war strategy. But in our modern era, we really try to mitigate civilian losses and hardship upon the civilian population. What this does, though, is it allows you the moral support of a civilian population to continue to produce and push and fund and support military personnel to fight against your army. That's why total warfare has become kind of the norm going forward, where it is easier to demoralize the civilian population than it is to completely destroy an army. It really is a very effective strategy. All right, so when he finally gets to Atlanta is a very important city in the South. It's where a vast number of the rail lines come in and out of, making it a strategic point of being able to store material and move material. And we talk about material, we're talking about war material. That'd be food, clothing, guns, bullets, you name it. It's coming in and out of Atlanta, and it's sent out to be supported to those frontline troops that really need it. And also, this is the hub of where that stuff is made. This is their industrial center. The North has a lot of industry, but it's spread out throughout the North. If you took one town in the North, you wouldn't be able to burn out the entire ability for the Union to wage war. In the South, Atlanta kind of was that one centralized location that was going to be able to fund and keep the war effort going. When Sherman shows up in there, he burns it to the ground. He razes it. He just annihilates it. You see pictures of Atlanta after Sherman goes through it. You just see skeletal structures of some buildings that used to stand. Some of the pictures look like a nuclear bomb had gone off and just wiped out the city itself. Sherman showed no mercy on Atlanta. He did what he could to make sure that it would not come back up again and be able to support the Confederate Army during this time frame. One person writes, since Atlanta, I felt as if we are going to be wiped off the earth. That is the impact that Sherman has on the Southern civilian population. That is a civilian who writes that. And therefore, this creates that sense of doom among the civilian population of the South, where they start to look for a way to end this war. Sherman continues on, and this is what most people call Sherman's March to the Sea. And Sherman had rearguard actions committed against him where there were small Confederate bands that would try to attack him, cut off his supply lines. Again, they were mainly feasting off the land. But they still need military supplies like guns and bullets and, the like such in order to continue to wage war. So this is where Sherman peels off a large contingent of his force, why we mostly talk about the 60,000 men, and he sends them after the chase off the marauders. And Confederate cavalry, which had been very effective throughout the war, finds itself suddenly getting thrashed by Union soldiers. When he gets when Sherman went east and north, he says that he's just going to go smash anything in his way. And he no longer has to do the destruction as he continues upward, because the Southerners, in trying to get out of his way and trying to stop him from going up to Savannah, they burn the fields, they burn the bridges, they smash the towns, they destroy the farms, all in the interest of keeping Sherman out of Savannah. And it's ineffective. Sherman has very effective engineers at this point. The Union military can supply itself by the sea. Remember, they have the blockade. So any supplies or resources that Sherman needs can be brought in by the sea and dropped off for him to be able to use. And eventually he does get to Savannah also. And so when he goes and takes Savannah, he smashes Savannah also. And then one of the quirks of Sherman, when he takes Savannah, he takes it right before Christmas, and he secures 25,000 bales of cotton. And he's like, "Hey, President Lincoln, I got a present for you," because of course cotton is still worth quite a bit of money. Okay, so with Sherman wreaking havoc in the South, the Southern armies find themselves undersupplied and under-equipped, and men deserting by the thousands to try to go protect their homes from Sherman's armies coming up from their back end. And so this starts to deplete Lee's forces throughout the entire battlefields. And so Grant shows up, and he's going to start to use what, again, I've talked about this before, but the war of attrition. And so he's going to throw his men wholesale against the South and just use sheer numbers to overwhelm their lines and create mass casualty situations. And this works for him. It works for him in a number of battles. When he's out there and you take like the Battle of the Wilderness. Yes, he does the Battle of the Wilderness. It's not necessarily a victory for Grant, but the sheer amount of destruction done to Lee's army creates a position where Lee can no longer hold the spot, and he has to take off and leave. Then it goes on to like the Battle of Cold Harbor, other battles across the board. Lee just has to continue to retreat because he cannot hold off against Grant. And Grant eventually makes it into Richmond. He burns it. Jefferson Davis is forced to escape the city and leave and run with the other leadership of the South. And they continue to bomb it and burn Richmond even to the ground. And Lee tries to move south, and he tries to meet up with another army in order to secure and rebuild his force in a way to try to oppose Grant. Also during this time frame is where you see the evolution of trench warfare as the war evolves into late 1864 into 1865. The Southerners really dig in, and they start to try using trench tactics that will eventually be used in World War I. If the European leaders had watched what had happened in the American Civil War, they probably would have thought twice about waging a trench warfare style of war. They might have convinced them otherwise. So when Lee finally makes his way south, as he's getting closer, he is cut off. He is surrounded, actually, instead by the Union Army. They create basically a pincer around him, and he can't get out. And what happens is his army in Appomattox is basically looking at either being crushed or they can surrender. And Lee states, "There's nothing left for me to do but go and see General Grant, but I'd rather die 1,000 deaths," because he knows that he's lost. And with him surrendering, he knows that's effectively the end of the Confederacy. While there's still other armies out there, there's other states still out there willing to fight and take up the cause. With the fall of Northern Virginia, the Army of Northern Virginia, that leaves all of Virginia open, and it's just a matter of time before Union troops can sweep and clean up anything else that is remaining there. Lincoln gave Grant fair latitude as to what to offer Lee, so he was able to offer him that the Southerners would leave all their military arms behind, He would let them leave the battlefield as long as they would be promised to be loyal to the Union. And lastly, they were able to keep their animals and take them home in order to which they could use to farm the land. So you can see it's still April. It's not quite planting season yet. But effectively, again, once Lee surrenders, this ends the war. The war goes on for about another 6 weeks before you get kind of the death throes completely of the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis tries to continue to wage the war. Jefferson Davis is still trying to seek some sort of resolution where he could maintain at least some independence in the South. Lincoln, on the other hand, basically demanded unconditional surrender just like Grant did. That he was not going to barter with them, and he knew that the South was defeated. Jefferson Davis, he was not fully convinced of it. In fact, when he tries to escape, he kind of gets caught in a humiliating way where he was dressed like a woman trying to escape from from his captors, and has end up caught, and there's pictures of it, political cartoons mainly all over the place. Jefferson Davis wearing women's clothing. When the war was over, you had to start counting the losses. And historians look over kind of the reports that are directly done by commanders, and that's how we normally have gotten a lot of the numbers of who died and how many people died in the Civil War. And it usually hovers somewhere around 650,000 men were lost in the Civil War. Modern historians, studying not just battlefield logs, because there's desertions, there's other things that happen, so you have kind of a mixed idea of how many men were actually lost. They instead started using census records and pouring through journals and diaries, and some people now have upped the sheer loss of life to close to like 750,000, and some people put it as high as 800,000 men died in the Civil War. It's the bloodiest war that America has ever fought, and with the largest loss of life period. And when we look at that many men who die, that's also not counting the casualties when we talk about the wounded. You have millions of men who are left permanently with loss of arms, legs, feet, hands, suffering from all sorts of other ailments. Some people have bullets lodged in their bodies for the rest of their life. Many of them can't go back to farming because they're missing limbs. Many of them suffer from severe cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, which creates mental problems for them. There's no effective remedies for that during the 1800s. So you see a group of men who come back completely devastated from the war. And this goes on, and it impacts even the healing between the two sides. If you guys ever watch like an old Western or something like that, you'll see that Northerners and Southerners run into each other, and they're like, dang Yankee, and you freaking rib. They still say this stuff like that, but there was still a lot of animosity, especially out west. When men start moving west, you see conflicts on the frontier between Yankees and Rebs still out there. And the Union basically controls the West with their cavalry units, and often you'd find Southerners run afoul of those cavalry units out there too. What happens, though, near the end of the war when we move into what's known as Reconstruction? Lincoln had some plans for Reconstruction, and he really thought that he'd be able to unite the North and the South again in a fairly amicable way so that they would be peaceful again and that they can heal those wounds. So Lincoln really was looking for a healing. Instead, on April 14th, a week after Appomattox Courthouse, Lincoln went to go watch a show at Ford's Theater, having a time out with his wife, kind of celebrating the victory. In the course of the show, John Wilkes Booth sneaks up behind Abraham Lincoln and shoots him in the back of the head. After he shoots him, he jumps off the stage. As he lands on the stage, his leg basically breaks through the wood, shatters his leg, and he goes limping off after shooting Lincoln, who dies later on that night. As he runs and tries to escape, eventually he is hunted down, caught, and he himself is also killed for the assassination of Lincoln. John Wilkes Booth was just an angry Southerner who was upset at Lincoln. And with the death of Lincoln, though, What happens next is when we look at Reconstruction, it probably would have gone a completely different way under Lincoln. While Lincoln was looking to heal, under the control of the radical Republicans and other Union leaders in the North, they become punitive towards the South, and they start to kind of put punishment measures in place. And also, African Americans do not come out on a positive note right out of the Civil War. During Reconstruction times, they were still widely discriminated against. Oftentimes, they're back working on plantations that they had just left in order to try to make a living wage because they don't know anything else to do. And then they suffer again for at least the next 100 years underneath very racist policies throughout the South. And so if Lincoln had lived, we would probably have seen a completely different reconstructive effort comparative to what we see under Jefferson Davis. And once we get back from summer break, you guys are going to jump right into Reconstruction, and we're going to talk about that as to what happens. All right, so this ends the unit on the Civil War. Make sure you guys finish up that study guide, and then we're going to, like I said, prepare for the test tomorrow, okay? I will see you then.